Hi, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Patching Problems, Navigating Vulnerability Identification and Post-Market Cybersecurity for Medical Devices. My name is Taylor Porter, and I'll be your host for this important discussion on securing medical device software. Expectations for medical device security are changing fast, especially with the FDA's new cybersecurity requirements now in place. Medical device manufacturers need ways to identify vulnerabilities in their software and better manage post-market updates and patches. Today, we'll dive into strategies for using software bill of materials, SBOMs, efficiently and how to handle high-risk vulnerabilities, how to smooth out your patching process, supporting compliance with the FDA post-market rules. We'll also break down a real-world example of a medical device manufacturer that discovered over 2,000 vulnerabilities in their legacy equipment and how they mitigated them. We're thrilled to have with us today Shane Fry, the CTO of RunSafe Security, and Phil Engler, the VP of Medical Device Security at Health-ISAC. Shane and Phil, can you give us a brief introduction of yourselves?
This is Phil Engler. I lead the Medical Device Security Initiative here at Health-ISAC. Health-ISAC is a InfoSec sharing organization, member-driven, over 900 members, 12,000 staff globally, encompassing all stakeholders in the healthcare sector, manufacturers, healthcare providers, big pharma, regulators, and all of those. So happy to be here, Shane. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Awesome. Excuse me. I'm Shane Fry. I'm the CTO here at RunSafe Security, and my background's been in vulnerability research, exploit development, from everything to physical hardware circuit security all the way up to web app security, and really have been focused in on embedded devices for the majority of my career, and been at RunSafe here for 7 years now, helping make devices more secure.
Thank you. And then just before we begin, I'm just going to go over some of the housekeeping notes. This webinar is recorded and will be made available after the webinar is finished if you wish to revisit the content. And then just feel free to post any questions to the available Q&A section so that we can address it at the end of today's presentation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Phil to begin.
Very good. Thanks, Taylor. Really appreciate it. I've had the agenda up to familiarize everybody with where we're heading in this conversation. So as we get started here, we're going to start with a poll. If we can get that kicked off, we'll give a few minutes. We'll look and see how that comes out. But as folks are contemplating the questions, the organizational challenges when it comes to med device security, Shane, let's talk a little bit about the new FDA and the EU MDR IVD compliance requirements. Their focus on the secure software development lifecycle, the total lifecycle approach for medical device security, and what are some of the challenges you're seeing with that medical devices manufacturers are having, particularly with managing the post-market security of legacy devices?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. You almost don't even know where to begin, to be honest. I think as you kind of tailored that towards the post-market side of things, it's definitely a concern. I mean, there's a lot of vulnerabilities aren't discovered until after you've shipped software, and that's kind of the unfortunate reality of the world today. So, there's got to be this SDLC on the development side as we shift left and do more testing and scanning and kind of preventative measures going left. But when you think about the whole life cycle of a medical device, whether that's a pacemaker or a patient monitor or CT scanner or something like that, how often are those devices getting updates? And part of the new guidance that's coming out, or I guess came out, is making sure that you've got a mechanism for providing those updates, and kind of leaning on providers to actually provide updates, and device manufacturers to provide updates, and then providers to actually deploy those updates, right? And that's a little easier if you've got a CT scan. You can just not schedule some CT scans, and I say easy. We're ignoring all the business loss of profit when devices are down and things like that. But you can work through that. But a pacemaker is different, right? Especially if you didn't design the pacemaker to have Bluetooth update capabilities, and how do you do that in a secure way? So There's definitely a lot to think about in the whole life cycle. And that's why understanding kind of your software bill of materials on the far left side as you're building software is really important. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Eh, because that helps you mitigate issues before they get deployed in the field.
So very good. And it looks like, the challenges our audience identified, they were evenly split between identifying and managing vulnerabilities, as you implied, right? And then also allocating the resources. So nobody has enough resources to do it all. And that's certainly a challenge there. And speaking of challenges, let's think about the class 2, class 3 medical devices. Maybe some of them are embedded systems, so what are some of the challenges and those operational impacts that they can have on patient care and healthcare operations?
Yeah, so you think about those devices, and they're more embedded devices. They're not web applications largely running, Node or Python, where you can easily generate a software bill of materials. And that's something where there's a lot of tooling today that can do that. But when you get to the embedded devices and you're doing Yocto and you're doing, C, C++, there are very few tools out there today that can give you a good, accurate software bill of materials for that. So if you don't have that software bill of materials, you don't know what vulnerabilities are known and already present in your software. And we see this all the time with development teams that have a Linux distribution from 10 years ago that they're updating their software, but they're not updating the Linux operating system underneath it. And you can have a ton of vulnerabilities there, and they're just not tracking them. And so that's a huge problem. And then you think about for people that are responsible for deploying these devices, you may not have a good SBOM. So how do you build an SBOM and manage kind of the vulnerabilities of the medical devices in your security perimeter? Uh, that's really tough, and that's where people look at binary-based SBOM solutions, and those are really limited in how much they can actually how accurate an SBOM they can get because they just have to guess at what's there, and some are better than others. But when we talk to device manufacturers that are using it, they're spending a lot of man hours hiring engineers to triage bad SBOMs. And so that's where you really want to start shifting into build time SBOMs so that what you're getting as your software bill of materials is exactly what showed up in the device. And then once you have that, you can then more easily understand that, security risk posture that those devices have.
So in considering the secure development lifecycle, right, knowing what vulnerabilities are associated with the component selection early on in the development process can certainly help organizations assess those risks, do those threat assessments, right, and even put compensating controls in or choose other components that may have less vulnerabilities, longer life cycle um, to go with. Let me so let's talk about because we're talking about how important the SBOMs are, and certainly SBOMs are asset management tools, right? They're lists of components, but they enable, and you implied this, they enable that vulnerability management. So can you dig into that, unpeel that onion back a little bit more, and talk about making the link between the components and the vulnerability management piece, both during production and post production.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the way you kind of simplified it. An SBOM is a list of components, and there's a lot that you can do with it, and you can get really mired in, where you're generating your SBOM, or are you including build tools or not? And there's a lot of details that we can chat for hours about, but really what it comes down to is what's the software that's in your system. And for a while, SBOMs are relatively new, but we've had this kind of concept with software composition analysis tools in the past. And then we've seen, all right, you must do SBOM, lots of executive orders and regulations coming, across the world for you must do SBOMs, but not going far enough to make them, you've got to act on them. Right. So cool, I can build a list and the list can be accurate, but what do we we need to analyze that list, and that's where we want to talk about SBOMs as more than just a compliance checkbox. Um, anybody can generate an SBOM, but if you don't care if it's accurate, if you don't care if it's complete, if you're not acting on that SBOM, using that to identify the vulnerabilities that are present there, then you don't know when you go to ship software that you've shipped something that's got a bunch of vulnerabilities in it as a device manufacturer. And on kind of the asset owner side, the provider side, you don't know if you're receiving software that has a bunch of vulnerabilities in it, right? We like to talk to people in the latter camp there and say, hey, you need to put pressure on your vendors to give you SBOMs, to give you secure software. And a lot of them go, well, we don't have an SBOM. It's like, well, that's step one. You got to ask for it. And then because ultimately, if a hospital gets hacked, it doesn't matter that the medical device was the problem. It matters that now they can't provide care, right? And so, they have a duty to make sure that their software is up to date and has less vulnerability. So, on the manufacturing side, it can be a really good indicator for whether or not you should ship software. Um, it's been, a good number of years now that we've been doing static code scanning and dynamic testing of applications. And not everybody's great at it, and not all the tools are great. In fact, some of them are quite terrible, but we're doing that. And then we have policies that say you're not going to ship something if you have a critical, buffer overflow in your code. Okay, you got to go back, fix that before you can ship. Well, we should be treating all the software that comes in our supply chain the exact same way. If there's a vulnerability in glibc or the Bluetooth daemon or some other communication protocol that's used in a medical device, we shouldn't ship it. We should treat that just as if it were proprietary code that we wrote. So that's a big piece in kind of the during manufacturing side of things. And then on the post market side, we want to make sure that those SBOMs are constantly being assessed. So if I generate an SBOM today, run it through some tooling and get a list of vulnerabilities, great. Let me go act on those. But then a week from now, a month from now, who's tracking those vulnerabilities in that software that's already been shipped? Because you may need to come back later and say, oh, this new vulnerability in the Linux kernel is present. We need to patch, or we need to deploy some other mitigation. Put a workaround out while we're sorting through getting this fixed. And that's where kind of the post market part of this really comes in, because these devices are going to be long lived. I don't know many hospitals that are buying CT scanners every year because they're breaking. Like they're going to be there for a long time. A lot of the devices that are implantables and wearables, like those are long lived devices. So we've got to make sure we keep those up to date and keep tracking the vulnerabilities against those SBOMs for things that we've shipped.
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? And I used to think legacy, they talk about legacy devices and how long lived they are. And the AHA, the American Hospital Association, puts out a book for the expected useful life of medical devices. And it was originally put out as a finance tool, right? How quickly, how many years should I depreciate the capital expenditure of this device, over the course of its life? And even many of those start at 7 years. They stretch to 11 and even 12 or 15 years, depending on the types of technologies. So, but just because those devices have been completely written off the financial books from a capital perspective, they still perform. They still do what they were purchased to do, and there may not be a reason to replace them, except if they run out of support. And it used to be manufacturer and support, and hospitals would figure out how long they could keep a device running for. And I think that equation needs to be changed, needs to be rethought, when it comes to vulnerabilities, because just like devices that need more and more maintenance, from a physical perspective, they also need more and more maintenance from a component and cybersecurity perspective as well, on that. So very good. We're going to move over to talking about some of the mitigations that we can do on these devices. We've got, I think, another poll for our attendees here, but let's talk a bit about, we've identified those vulnerabilities, right? And how are manufacturers then picking up on those, right? Monitoring them, assessing them, and acting on them.
Yeah, I mean, it varies uh, wildly, to be honest. We have, there are some device manufacturers that are, doing everything they can to not push software out, and, minimize criticality and things like that. And in some cases that's warranted, right? If you need physical access to a pacemaker to attack it, if the pacemaker's in someone's body, like you're probably you can downgrade that severity. But as these devices get more and more interconnected, we're providing better patient outcomes by having blood glucose monitors that can connect to your phone, and give you a warning and wake you up in the middle of the night when your blood sugar crashes. That's really fantastic, but now that's increased attack surface, and so we've got to be very careful about how we address these vulnerabilities. Um, and one of the things we see a lot in the medical space is, patching takes time for embedded devices, for medical devices where you've got patient safety concerns. You can't just run something through a CI pipeline, ship it, and hope that it's good, right? You've got to have some confidence in what you've shipped. So that means, really understanding what you're patching and making sure that the the fix works, the vulnerability is gone, but then also that you haven't, caused a situation where someone's life's at risk, or invalid results are coming out of a patient monitor or something like that. Um, and so that process is very time consuming. And it can be exceptionally difficult, as you talked about legacy devices earlier, right? How do you, deal with a device that's outside of the scope of their support contract? Um, and so, really thinking about that is important. And if you can deploy mitigations, at the source code level or at build time, where you can mitigate vulnerabilities for the life of the device, whether or not it's supported, that's super critical. And that's where RunSafe started its business 7 years ago, was trying to say, hey, let's go protect these legacy devices and before they're completely out of support, so that people that are deploying the devices in the future have protection against these vulnerabilities. And that's where you can kind of look at, runtime exploitation, prevention technologies, things like RASP, or moving target defense, can really increase the device resilience, throughout the life cycle of the device. So while it's supported and still getting patched, great, but then afterwards as well. And so, I think it's really useful to kind of walk through a case study on that, and we got some numbers on the next slide, actually.
We do, and I just wanted to follow up on a
Oh,
couple things here. So,
yep.
our poll was around the confidence of being able to detect and patch, right? And it seems like we have a very mature audience, right? Almost 50% said they were somewhat confident, and another 24% said that they were, very confident that that they had detect and patching capabilities in place. So very good for our audience. Uh, and as we're talking about this, because we talk about runtime, right? One of the things you talked to me in an earlier conversation or mentioned to me was addressing those. Hang on here. Let's see, addressing the kinds of vulnerabilities that are particular in that. And so we have on the left, the memory safety vulnerabilities, so 70% of high severity bugs fit into that memory safety defects, right? So how does RunSafe, protect against that, not just for the vulnerabilities known today, but talk about, the vulnerabilities that will emerge in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, this is a really interesting area that I find fascinating, is as we look at, across industries, whether that's, healthcare, medical devices, automotive, OT, even IT, there's very different sets of, vulnerability classes that you're likely to see. And as we get to kind of more of the embedded devices, everyone says our devices are different. We do things differently. We're special. We do stuff nobody else is doing. And maybe for the device that you're making, that might be true. the actual functionality of the device. But from a security perspective, we see it, like you said, about 70% of all the embedded device vulnerabilities are memory safety related. So that's buffer overflows, heap use after freeze. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is the majority of them are high in critical CVSS scores, whether you use V2, V3, V4, they tend to be in the high critical range. But if you dig a little deeper into how long it takes for those vulnerabilities to be patched, a SQL injection bug can usually be patched in a day. Sometimes even shorter than that. But the mean time to remediate a buffer overflow in embedded devices is like 180 days. And so that's why we're 6 months of knowing about a vulnerability before we get a patch out. And then we've got, in plus one or more days before you even get to actually have that deployed somewhere. So that's where where runtime protections can really be useful, because you can get mitigations against uh, these various vulnerability classes um, on the device itself and not have to wait 6 months for a patch to come out. And so, as we think about memory safety vulnerabilities, the case study here that we looked at was with a medical device manufacturer. They generated a software bill of materials, and they suddenly had 2,000 vulnerabilities that they needed to triage. And that's crazy. That's so much work. And so how do we mitigate that? How do we reduce that? Well, when we dug into the vulnerabilities with them, 49% of them could be mitigated by deploying the RunSafe technology, our protection technology. And so that's, in this case, 49% are memory safety, buffer overflows, CPUs after freeze, things like that. 77% of their critical vulnerabilities could be mitigated as well. So again, back to this memory safety in embedded devices, the vast majority of these are critical and high vulnerabilities. And then they were able to take 100% of the memory safety vulnerabilities away through our protection capabilities. And so what's really neat about that is these three bubbles here represent a snapshot in time of vulnerabilities in an SBOM. But as we continue to see more and more vulnerabilities in that device that's already been protected, we're going to see the protections stay the same. More vulnerabilities are going to fall into the bucket. So, they will have had some, time investment, cost investment getting things integrated, but then they're going to see value for the duration that they support the device and then some. And so I think that's really fascinating.
So absolutely, and it sounds like these tools are like an investment in the future, right? We know that new and emerging vulnerabilities will be discovered, right? But if we're already providing the protections for them, right, then that's less effort in order to maintain those in the future, make sure that they're addressed, that they can't be exploited, that they've got controls in place there. So let's do that, right? So the kind of just transitioning to that post-market view, of the world, right? How does that really work on that? And while you're teeing this up, I think we've got another user poll here that we can have our users think about. I do want to mention there's a Q&A in the bottom. If you hadn't noticed, and if you have questions that you would like answered, we can address those at the end of the piece. So feel free to do that. And again, we're looking for how familiar are you with runtime, exploit prevention tools for that, and we'll let Shane talk about some of the benefits on the post-market security side.
Yeah. So, as we look at, new, well, I say new, I'm very used to working in the world where new is anything in the last 5 years, much less, in some cases 10 years. But as we look at the current regulatory environment, being able to say that you've got, SBOMs and you're doing SDLC and you're taking those SBOMs and doing vuln management with them, that's great. But if you can then go in and say, we're protecting the device forward for vulnerabilities that might be found afterwards, you're going to really strengthen that pre-market submission. And so that, should be useful for reducing your time to market. And then, one of the things we see a lot in our commercial customer base is when developers have these protections in place, vulnerabilities are still important. We should, try not to write bad code that introduces vulnerabilities, but you can have less interrupts on your developers because they can be focused on delivering, bug fixes or new capability, new features, instead of spending their time constantly chasing all these vulnerabilities and kind of hair on fire. It's a Saturday morning, there's a 0-day vulnerability that just got disclosed, and now you've got to go do something. With our protections in place, that might now, instead of be a critical vulnerability, might be medium or low, because the attacker can't take over the device. They can just deny service. And so you can think about that as part of your kind of security response, um, can really reduce that interruption to your developers. And then obviously, if we can prevent exploitation of devices, you're going to have much better medical device resilience for your software. And so your devices are going to be less likely to be the front page of a New York Times article. And so, that's obviously very important. And then, as we think about security, one of the key things for us is that we want to make sure that there's no effect or change to behavior or performance to systems. So, understanding that, you know, taking measurements or, uh, looking at how much insulin you're pumping in, or IV rates and things like that. We can't impact that. But so you want to be able to make sure that the security solutions you're deploying don't change those behaviors. We've talked to some vendors that have investigated other solutions and seen that in deploying their security product, that their devices stopped working. Well, that's not good. Nobody wants that, right? And so, that's really key, that we want to make sure that we're not changing system behavior or system overhead. And then, as we think about it, security, people always joke in the security community and outside the security community that any security you add can basically slows down your process. It stops, developer productivity. It, potentially impacts your users. And we really want to make sure that that's not the case. So we want to give you that protection against vulnerabilities about, and vulnerabilities you don't know about, but still give you something that's really easy to integrate and is kind of transparent to your developers. So we've got customers that have vendors onboarded that the vendors don't even know they're onboarded, because they have a build environment that includes us, and the vendors don't have to worry about it. And so they can, kind of do their development workflows as usual, and not have to worry about, how their build process is changed or what they're doing. And so that's really exciting, to be able to not be a drag on productivity or, the user workflow or user experience. We can increase security and still have the device be perfectly functional.
Oh, it's interesting. One of the things that crossed my mind as you were going through that great explanation and all the points there was, the unpredictability that the human behavior of, vulnerabilities bring into the system, and it sounds like really, a strong pre-market submission, one that's well thought out with good controls in place, really is an investment in the post-market. If you can reduce the amount of effort needed to sustain these devices long term, throughout their life. I work with the cyber update and patching work group with a health sector coordinating council, and one of the things that we look at, one of the concerns that's raised on the HDO side, right, is what happens when patches don't work? Is there a rollback to it? Can we reestablish device functionality? If a patch has failed, and it sounds like having proactive measures, right, reduces the need to patch. So it reduces the opportunity for failure. It reduces the level of investment needed in resources to, locate the devices, apply the patch, test the device after the fact on that. So,
Yeah,
as we
absolutely. And if I could add one more thing to that real quick,
please,
one of the
please.
things is, as you think about, you know, how do we unroll, like, how do we roll back a patch? Well, why did we have to do that in the first place? Probably because we rushed through testing to where we didn't get to test all the possible ways a patch could go wrong. And so if you have this proactive security that protects your devices uh, for vulnerabilities that are discovered tomorrow, then you can spend that little bit extra time making sure that the patch goes cleanly and that things work properly. And so, we see a lot of value in that. And, it'd be great if you could say, yeah, we're going to patch with confidence now because our vendor took an extra day or an extra week, but we weren't vulnerable while the vendor took their time getting this patch right. Um, you know, Talk about confidence and patching. That would be fantastic. Um,
Yeah, yeah. So interesting. The results of our poll, right, were almost the opposite of the patching confidence, right? Where 75% roughly had somewhat, were either somewhat or very confident in their organization's ability to identify and apply patches, right? Only about 25% of our participants were, very familiar and regularly use the runtime exploit prevention tools, right? So one of the challenges you talked about SBOM creation, and one of the great challenges of the business is different tools produce different results depending on the scan and the analysis tools that are in place there. So how would you have a conversation, regarding quality SBOMs, making sure, because we talked about it's important on the pre-market side, it's important for post-market, but it's also important for the customers, the folks that are buying devices in order for them to manage the security risks that the products that they purchase from device manufacturers introduce into their environment.
yeah, I mean, quality is super important. The we did a proof of concept with a customer that I can't name, where they wanted us to show an exploit targeting their device. We spent a ton of time and money showing them a vulnerability, only to find out that the SBOM was wrong and they didn't have that software in their environment. And so, they were frustrated by that. We were too. But if you don't know what software you have in your device that you're shipping, you're gonna definitely uh you're going to be at a place where you can't effectively know what your risk posture is. So from a pre and post market perspective, um you don't have a way of knowing what the vulnerabilities are, and then you're caught flat-footed when somebody like Armis or IOActive or any number of the security research organizations come out and say, hey, look, we've got all these vulnerabilities we need you to patch. Okay, well, that's good. But it'd be better if you could be ahead of that. And better if you could have patches available for your vendors already. So having a good quality SBOM is important. And like I said, we do our SBOMs at software build time. And my analogy to that for folks that aren't super in the weeds of SBOMs day to day is, if someone brought you a delicious pizza for lunch and asked you to describe all the ingredients in the pizza down to the flour brand, and what type of cheese, and what toppings, you might get some things right, but you're going to get some stuff wrong. And that's what happens if you've got a binary based SBOM. Some of the best players in the space just have a large library of heuristics that they're guessing based on what they see in the software. And that leads to a lot of false positives on the pre-market side, where folks are having to chase down and triage hundreds, if not thousands, of vulnerabilities that are actually false positives. But that's engineering effort. It's security team efforts that have to go into understanding, is this really a problem? Because you can't always just jump to the latest version of your software in your supply chain. And then on the other side, if you've got, uh, a source-based SBOM, that's like someone giving you a recipe for pizza and saying, well, this matches what you have, but when you went to the store, they didn't have that brand of flour, so you got a different brand of flour. Well, if there's a problem with the flour and you just based it off the SBOM that you had at the recipe time, it's not going to be accurate either. So, we really think there's a lot of value in generating those SBOMs at build time, so the device manufacturers can know what's really in their software.
Right, and you kind of alluded to one of the issues that I've discovered in some of the SBOMs that I've analyzed, and that's the naming, and versioning problem. I'm a clinical engineer by trade. We had almost 400,000 different medical devices, and biomeds or clinical engineers are the most creative spellers in the world, which was a challenge from data analysis perspective, right? I mean, there's 13 different ways to spell GE, amazingly. But let's go back to pre-market submissions a little bit, right? So one of the challenges we're providing proactive preventions, for known unknowns, right? For vulnerabilities that aren't even known today. So when you work with your medical device manufacturers, how are you helping them shape that message, so that they can, submit a risk analysis to the FDA for submission review and convince them that these proactive measures, will be effective, even though, they're not, let's say, fully tested against vulnerabilities that have not yet been discovered.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of things that we've done there that's really helpful. So a lot of what we have done over the last 3 or 4 years with academic researchers is applicable here. So we've taken on some studies with North Carolina State University to take a look at the prevalence of memory safety vulnerabilities and how long they take to get patched, and what vulnerabilities are being targeted. And so we did some academic studies with them where they did some machine learning approaches of analyzing thousands of exploits to determine actions that vulnerability or that exploits are taking on devices, to look at which actions on devices we can actually impact. And actions here aren't necessarily we moved a servo or we adjusted, a fluid rate or something like that, but more, low level at the processor level and operating system level. But then, we can provide that study to our customers to say, here's the categories of weaknesses that we can have an impact against based on how they're actually being exploited in the wild today. So, that gives you some, as unbiased as you can get, right? We solicited this study hoping for good outputs, and did end up getting some good output, but uh, so that's one way we go about it. The other thing that we do is we've got a risk reduction analysis that we can do on firmware images that have been built and are going to be going onto devices, where we can look at kind of the full range of attacks that an attacker can actions an attacker can take against a device based on the software that's there, and then show our customers how RunSafe's technology mitigates those hundreds of thousands or millions of possible attacks based on the way our technology works.
Oh, and is that aligned to the MITRE ATT&CK framework?
So it's a layer below MITRE's attack framework. So you know attack is really good if you're looking at like an entire network and a large set of things, but when you get down to like an individual device having a buffer overflow and then an attacker opening files or executing a program, it doesn't exactly align with the attack framework because it's kind of a subset of attackers executing code on the device. But
Gotcha.
we're looking at the low level things they could do, and kind of bubble that up.
Very nice. Very nice. So, okay, so we just looked at some of the pre-market stuff. So let's come back and, talk about, again, or revisit the long life of these devices, the broad spectrum of types of devices, that's there. I think the FDA has, over 560 product codes, the three-letter codes for connectable or software-enabled medical devices alone. So the spectrum is anything from, pressure gauges that can be implanted in a vein, through a catheter procedure, up through, infusion therapy, laser therapy, radiation therapies that go on, the ability to monitor physiology at the bedside. more and more we're pushing devices to the home environment. These are more likely embedded devices. And so we're creating, a less well-known networked environment. So given, where the technology innovation is leading, how does RunSafe fit into protecting, let's say, that expanding threat surface?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a perfect fit, right? I mean, as we think about attack surface that we can take away from our customer devices, we're looking at, any place where untrusted data could come in, any, connectivity over radios or physical, cable connectors and things like that. And so as we see more and more devices get connectivity and, as you mentioned, shifting outside of a controlled network environment, right? Um, a lot of medical practitioners will say, well, we have firewalls and we have, EDR and XDR, and we've got all these intrusion detection prevention things. And that's great. We should do those things, but, you know, they're not, they don't protect the last mile. They're looking for things after something bad has already happened. And that's a little bit of a losing proposition in my mind, especially if you have the option to deploy something that can protect the last mile, that device itself. Um, but as you start to think about now, you said these devices are going to people's homes. They're connecting to people's phones and laptops and Wi-Fi networks. Those are all places where you know the average person isn't as cyber aware as a hospital might be. Which isn't even as cyber aware as most cyber practitioners are. So, there's a whole lot more exposure there. And you mentioned devices that might be implantable in a person. If you're just walking around and someone can attack your pacemaker in the middle of New York City, that's a bad day, right? Uh, and so there's a lot of value in being able to protect devices, especially as they're leaving those kind of secure perimeters.
Right, right. And speaking of New York City, right, the FDA has often, talked about being able to protect attacks at scale, right? So that's exactly, if you can attack one pacemaker, how many other pacemakers can be attacked. And the FDA has made it a point, one of the challenges of securing these devices, is that human nature, human behavior is not predictable, right? And so they take the likelihood of exploit out, and they just say it's either exploitable or it's not, right? And so if it is exploitable, and it can produce harm, you need to address it as a manufacturer. And on the flip side of that, they say, that human nature cannot be relied upon as a protective measure, right? My patients are going to keep their phones and their software up to date. They're, not going to do unrisky things like go, be susceptible to drive-by or sidecar attacks on here. So elements like that. But we're coming up, we're almost up to the top here. So if you were to leave, we got a great audience here. If you were to leave these folks with three key takeaways that they can take back to their boss, what would that be?
Yeah, I think, number one, obviously, I think is it's, super directly relevant for medical devices is, really be focused on getting an accurate SBOM. Uh, you know, Obviously, I'd love for RunSafe to be your provider, but if you can get an accurate SBOM from someone, that's going to help you. The value of that is huge. So getting something accurate, ideally at build time, so that it's and easily updated in your CI pipelines or software build processes. That's probably the number one thing. You can do so much with a good SBOM that a bad SBOM is just going to drag you down. Um, and then, I think for I'll take the other two takeaways and kind of split them into different use cases. So for device manufacturers, really look at how you can take whole classes of vulnerabilities away. If you look at your device and you say, we've got so much web stuff going on here because it's intended to be in a data center or at a hospital or something like that. Go look at your frameworks for looking at whole classes of vulnerabilities. What can you take away? If it's an embedded device where you've got a lot of compiled code, look for ways that you can mitigate, whole swaths of those vulnerabilities. Playing whack-a-mole is terrible. I found vulnerabilities for the majority of my career, uh, it's tough, and patching them is even harder. So, finding ways to kind of categorically eliminate threats is going to pay off way more dividends than you getting really good at fixing critical vulnerabilities one by one. And then for kind of the customer side of things, the provider side, really lean on your device manufacturers to provide you those SBOMs. There was a good talk at S4 last year, which is kind of an ICS OT conference. So it's not healthcare specific, but I think a lot of it applies. That a lot of folks were talking about how hard it was to get SBOMs out of their vendors. And so, if you can add SBOM delivery as part of your, contractual delivery requirements for purchase, I think that's definitely worth doing. Get those SBOMs, push your vendors to actually ship you secure software. So that would be my three takeaways.
All right. Yeah, sounds like really solid advice. Before we get into our Q&A, and we know we'll run out of time on this, but how should folks, engage with RunSafe Security if they're interested in learning more about, your approach, your tool, and elements like that?
Yeah, so we've got our main website, runsafesecurity.com. You can email sales at runsafesecurity.com, or you can go create an account on our platform, which is app.runsafesecurity.com, and we can walk you through with that app. You get a 14-day free trial. You can generate SBOMs. You can do the proactive security, build that into your devices. We're happy to support that as well. We do all that without taking your credit card, so you can really see the value without having to, uh, first get approval for, some corporate purchase. So um,
Nice,
that's the
nice.
path.
In healthcare, we call that a wallet triage. So, okay. So very good. A really great conversation, Shane. I really enjoyed that. Taylor, if there are any questions in the queue that you'd like to us to address, I think this would be a good time to walk through any of those.
Yep, so one question I have is, can you give an example of how vulnerability identification and mitigation played out for a manufacturer who assessed their legacy equipment and what the outcomes were of doing so?
Yeah. So, we talked about kind of the case study, kind of at a high level, and what percentage of vulnerabilities they found that were high critical, that were, memory safety related. But, one of the things out of that was prior to getting an accurate SBOM, or an SBOM in general, in this case, they were tracking 4 vulnerabilities for their devices. And then suddenly they had 2,000 vulnerabilities that they were tracking for a single device. And so that was a huge uh, moment where they couldn't stick their head in the sand and ignore the problem anymore. They knew they had a major problem. They knew they needed, some sort of solution to fix it. And so, we were able to help take, in that case, 49% of the vulnerabilities off the table for them. And I think that numbers would end up higher. We didn't go and triage all the false positives, but I know there were a bunch of false positives in there as well. Um, so, I think that's an example where someone thought they were doing great managing security until they got good data, and then they realized their process was flawed, and they needed a better solution.
Thanks. I'm sure going from 4 to 2,000 vulnerabilities was a huge shock for them as
It
well.
it really was. The email we got from them was, "So what are we supposed to do about this? Like, you can't put the genie back in the bottle when you suddenly know about all these vulnerabilities." Um, and that's one of the areas that we're really glad we can help customers is, you know, uh, there's a prevailing notion from device manufacturers today that if I deploy SBOM generation and get a good SBOM, I now have some requirement to fix these vulnerabilities. And so by doing a good thing and generating SBOMs, I now am being punished by having all these vulnerabilities and all this extra work to do. And so that's where, I mentioned earlier, kind of categorically fixing vulnerabilities, CWEs, common weaknesses, is really how you get the best of both worlds there. You can get good data from an SBOM, and then, also take everything off the table all in one go.
Shane, I have a question related to that, right? One of the things that, the FDA has been talking about with submissions, right, is the complete map, from the threat analysis where you identify what are, the ways that hackers might exploit these kinds of technologies. What's the risk assessment? What are the CWEs? How are they done? And then the controls that are put in place. And it sounds like the solution, may automatically apply controls, but the other element of that is the testing, demonstrating that those controls are effective. So do you work with your customers, in doing that? Obviously, we can't see into the future and test for things that don't exist yet, right? But how are you working with your manufacturing partners to help them prepare for those submissions that show, that proactive protections, block activity and are effective, in that?
Yeah, a couple of things. And actually, Bill, can we go forward 2 slides? Because I'm going to reference the QR code here. So one of the things we do with our customers is a risk reduction analysis. So we look at both known and unknown vulnerabilities. Um, one more forward. Um, we look at both known and unknown vulnerabilities. So you can upload your firmware image and an SBOM, and we kind of give you that complete picture. We help you categorize the risk from the unknown side, and we tell you what the known vulnerabilities are that are present based on that SBOM. And so that's one way we work with our device manufacturers is to help them understand that complete picture. In some cases, we've worked with manufacturers that had existing vulnerabilities that they knew in their devices, and we go back and actually integrate protections on an old version that has a known vulnerability, and then we can show that without their patch in place, the vulnerability was mitigated, and an exploitation wasn't successful. Now that requires a little bit more of an advanced security organization. That can do that, but we've done that with a handful of customers, and that works out really well. And then that can be a data point for the assessor to go, okay, hey, we've we've talked about this from the academic side, we've proven it in using an old vulnerability that we know about, and then we've also got this risk quantification for future stuff that we've looked at the whole picture and seen how much we can reduce out of that whole picture.
Nice, nice. It sounds like an important part of telling that story, right, during the submission, or even within your own quality, QRS system in the manufacturing environment. So, Taylor, is there another question? We've got a few minutes here.
Yeah,
Is there
just
another question
one
in the queue?
more. What are the biggest risks to medical devices today and in the future? And how can manufacturers prepare and balance compliance, innovation, and security?
Yeah, I mean, so I think on the one hand, it'd be easy to say the biggest risk is memory safety vulnerabilities, but we've talked about that a lot. So I'll maybe talk in a different way. Where I think the biggest risk is not doing SDLC properly, which is going to include some of the memory safety vulnerabilities in that. But you know, if you can't ship a device, if you can't get it to market because you're not meeting the regulations and the requirements, it doesn't matter how cool of a device you build. It doesn't matter how great your next generation MRI is or CT scan is. You've got to be able to you know get through the process and get approval. And so companies that are I think the biggest risk is that companies are going to try and just do the bare minimum in the compliance side of things and then get caught flat-footed when there's an increase in regulations or requirements, quicker turnaround times or things like that. And so companies that are going to go above and beyond on the security side, I think are going to be well situated for the next release and the release after that to get through the process faster, quicker, more efficiently. And so, I think having the fundamentals in place is going to help people get those more innovative devices, get those better devices out into market faster.
Very good. Very good. Well, I think that's where we'll end this today. Shane, this was a great conversation. I always enjoy talking to you, and I learned so much from this. Hopefully our audience has as well. Um, Please feel free if we can do this again in the future. We'd look very much forward to it.
Yep. Thanks for hosting, Taylor. Great discussion, Phil. And hopefully we can do this again soon.
Look forward to it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, taking time out of your busy day, and we'll see you again soon.